What is a hero? A mythological figure, often of divine descent, endowed with great strength or ability? An illustrious warrior? No. It's a person admired for achievements and noble qualities, one who shows great courage. Welcome to the What's a Hero podcast, where we dive deep into what a hero is and what makes them that hero. I'm your host, Ken Frownfelter, and I'm going to be introducing you to some of the world's most likely and unlikely heroes. You may have never heard of them before, and they most likely have never met you. But they all have one thing in common. They are ready to do whatever it takes to help make you better, even if it means sacrificing everything for you. Let's get into it.
This is episode 83 of the What's a Hero podcast with me, Ken Frownfelter. Recipients of the Medal of Honor have distinguished themselves through conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of their lives, above and beyond the call of duty. Congress created the Medal of Honor during the early years of the Civil War. Since then, about 3,500 individuals have been awarded the Medal of Honor. Candidates are nominated by their commanders, and at least 2 eyewitnesses must attest to the candidate's actions. There is an extensive review and vetting process. When the honor is granted, the president bestows the medal in a ceremony at the White House. The award honors those who put aside their fear and fight to preserve freedom and to protect their fellow soldiers, airmen, seamen, and Marines in all theaters of war, often against overwhelming odds. And this is the opening page to a book called Medal of Honor. In this specific book, and it's kind of a series of books that goes over these heroes who have distinguished themselves in the ability to save lives of other people, serve their fellow man and women by nearly giving their lives, and some actually do give their lives, so they can accomplish their mission, or they can save their fellow soldier, airman, seaman, or Marine. And it doesn't matter what's going on, just the fact that they're in any theater of war when this is happening. This one that we're specifically going to talk about today, that I'm going to get into, is around the area of Italy during World War II, actually January 30th, 1944, in the city of Anzio, Italy. And it begins with Lieutenant Jack Cleveland Montgomery led his platoon through the icy cold, knee-deep seawater towards the beach. As he did, he thought about the way things worked in the U.S. Army, how the decisions of where and when to fight were made. The generals never asked the guys on the ground, the platoon leaders, like him, for their opinions. They just gave the orders. He sure wished they'd asked this time. In private conversations, most every one of his fellow officers wondered about this battle plan. They said it made no sense. It was too rushed. They had air support and plenty of troops, but a lot was missing to ensure the successful mission. First was the lack of critical intelligence. Which divisions of the German army were facing them? How many infantry? How many artillery? How many paratroopers? German forces had been chased out of Sicily, the large Mediterranean island just off the toe of boot-shaped Italy, and were scrambling to get into position to hold the Italian peninsula. The Italians had already surrendered. Their air force shot out of the sky. Did the Luftwaffe have pilots and planes ready to attack? No one knew exactly what was ahead. The Germans were concentrating their defense along the Gustav Line, which stretched roughly 100 miles across the northwest part of the Italian peninsula. Thousands of soldiers manned machine guns and artillery in trenches and concrete fortifications across the mountains. Planted with landmines and strung with barbed wire, this defensive position blocked the most logical and direct route from the south to Rome, the capital of Italy. The officers of the U.S. landing forces understood that Adolf Hitler, the German, was incensed at how quickly the Italian army had folded after the Allies showed up. If he hadn't if he didn't divert German troops to slow the enemy's advance north through Italy, the Allies could march right up to Berlin or invade southern France, which his forces occupied. Now we're looking at basic logistics in which these guys are going in. As was stated before, Lieutenant Montgomery was sitting here looking at this whole thing and thinking, why don't these generals ask us before they put us through this hell? Why don't they say, hey, what do you guys think about doing this? No, because obviously they're going to say no. This is a needed thing. This area in which these guys are going into is needed to, because the logistics of, if they open this up, Italy was friendly with Germany because Italy borders Switzerland, it borders Austria. Just above that, you've got Germany, if you're looking at on a map, right? They land into the, I don't know, the eastern coast of Italy, and so they can move in. This area in Anzio, what we talked about, Anzio is just south of Rome. They'll move right up. They can take Rome. They can move right up, keep going up through Switzerland, up through Austria, get right into Germany, and take Berlin. If they do that, they have total control. Italy was obviously a member of the Axis powers that Hitler was in league with, and he was so frustrated with the fact, like it mentions here, that these guys folded so quickly. Italy was not a powerhouse that Germany was, and they hadn't thought that the Americans were going to be as tough as they were going into this either. And we've talked about the things that Hitler did before, and we've talked about things that the way that his troops weren't necessarily super proud of him and the way he was doing what he was doing. However, the Allies had banded together to defeat Hitler, which the Allies included Britain, France, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and the Soviet Union, China, and the United States of America, which is crazily different from where the world is today. Nearly 60, 70 years later, we're looking at this, nearly 80 years almost, and we're looking at this, and we're seeing these countries in which we're kind of at odds with a little bit. Would we go into, if we went into another big war like this, they wouldn't necessarily be our allies. Some of them. I mean, we look at Soviet Union, Russia, and China. Those aren't necessarily our allies, because not only that, you fast forward 15 years and we're at war with China. Kind of a back-channeled war when we went to Korea, but who was fighting the majority of Korea's war? Right, China. Nevertheless, these guys need to get into Anzio. They need to get into Italy so they can start moving north, so they can get up there and do what they needed to do. However, as they're going through, Montgomery is looking at it, and he's trying to figure out how he can do the best job that he could do to get his men up there to accomplish the mission and to help start winning this war. So back into it, it says, Jack Montgomery had fought with the Allied forces a few months earlier as they cut through Sicily like a sharp knife through cheese. He had earned a battlefield commission and was promoted from sergeant to second lieutenant. Now they had sailed around the Gustav line, and Rome was within their reach. Still, it wasn't going to be easy. It never was. Lieutenant Montgomery and his men had no idea they would end up fighting some of the Nazis' most battle-hardened troops. The second problem, and the most critical for an infantryman as far as Lieutenant Montgomery was concerned, was that they were going ashore with almost 36,000 troops, but without nearly enough armor. The Thunderbirds, the 45th Infantry, with about 1,500 Native American soldiers were landing behind the German lines. Only one division of armor was attached to the operation, providing limited tanks and not enough heavy artillery for ground fire troops. Not good. Without enough armor, infantrymen like Montgomery and his platoon didn't tend to last long in a fight. And it's like going into anything. These guys are going and they have the only thing saving their lives is their own flesh and blood. That's keeping them alive. They need armor. They need tanks. They need something to come in and go ahead of them so they can get behind it. So he's struggling to try to figure out, how am I going to get up there? How are we going to get up there? How are we going to live through this? One, because he doesn't want any of his men to die. Aside from that, how is he going to get up there, move through it, and go accomplish the mission? But in truth, this was how the army worked. When leaders saw an opportunity, they took it. The generals studied maps and intelligent briefings. They discussed the best way to deploy forces. They made plans, but most of the time it was ready or not approach. And this was mostly how it worked back in the 40s. If they thought they had a chance to land behind enemy lines and punch Hitler in the mouth, which is what they thought they would be able to do, which is what comic books showed, it's what we know from, take Captain America movies and everything. We're just going to go punch Hitler, and that was the idea. That everybody was going to go punch a Nazi and call it a day. It's a little more difficult than that. So whether or not they had the right number of troops, ships, equipment, or whatever, we go do it anyways. We're going to go. We're just going to get going with it. And they didn't care what a lieutenant in the infantry thought about their plans, especially when the lieutenant was a Cherokee who belonged to a National Guard regiment. His opinions went to the back of the line. It was his job to fight when he was told to. The army wasn't interested in his suggestions. "Dang, this water's cold," he heard a voice behind him say. "It ain't gonna get any warmer from all your hot air," a no-nonsense sergeant groused. The soldiers of his platoon trudged through the water in full gear, packed weighed down with ammunition and rations. Lieutenant Montgomery could tell his men were nervous and scared. Stumbling along, suffocating by the equipment, so heavy they could barely move. They could almost feel the German guns pointed directly at them. That was another thing that bothered Montgomery. There weren't enough landing craft. Instead, many troops rode in small boats as close to the shore as they could, and then waited the rest of the way. The whole operation felt rushed from the start. With a landing craft, you at least had a fighting chance. It could drive right up on the beach with its machine guns blazing, giving you covering fire. The ramp lowered, and you ran out of it like a fox chasing a hen until you found cover. Now, you might know these landing craft. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, you've seen them. It's the Higgin boats. They come up, they get right up on the shore. They're a big box, basically. Get up there, ramp falls, guys rush out. The problem with that is that thing just opens up. As soon as that opens up, there's nothing covering those guys. They have to move, and they have to move fast. The other side, like he was talking about these small boats, there was no armor as they got up to the beach. So it was just get in there and get up on the beach, jump out and get running. They had no armor up until that point. So the difference would be the armor that they would have as they're moving in. And as soon as they're there on the beach, then it opens up. And a lot of times, if you've seen Private Ryan or Saving Private Ryan, you see how guns, and they would have all these bunkers and ramparts and everything along the beaches so they can take out these landing craft. And a lot of times you would see, and these landing craft were run by the Navy, and there were these Army soldiers within it. So there was a lot of coordination going on, but these guys were having to get in there, and it was just not the most ideal way to go. But at the time, that's what we had. Now you could drop parachutists, you can paratroopers in there, but that was, they were still taking the chance of getting shot out of the sky. So none of this is just an easy way to go. These guys were scared to death, trying to figure out how they're going to do it. And this is what they were doing, and this is what they had to work with. The smallest piece of cover would do if they could get off that landing craft. That thing opens up, they find this, whatever they could find. Maybe a broken down another piece of landing craft, or there were big old chalks out there, or you find a big rock on the on the beach or something along those lines. You're getting behind that. You find that as much as you can. Anything that would make you feel like would offer the smallest amount of protection. The only thing that Montgomery couldn't understand was, here they were waiting ashore, and there was no resistance. No Germans or Italian machine guns or artillery attempting to halt their advance. At least not yet. He didn't like it. Had they somehow surprised the Germans? Were they expecting the Allies to land somewhere else? The platoon finally reached the shallows, and Montgomery and his team splashed ashore. The usually incessant German shelling had momentarily ceased. Montgomery and his men had been ordered and reinforcements for an offensive taking place a few miles inland. So far, Allied air power had been unable to knock out the German guns waiting to greet the invaders. Montgomery studied the terrain around them. Far off in the distance, he could see rocky mountain ranges. They were covered in thick woods. If he were the Germans scrambling to get into position to defend against the invasion, that's where he would go. He wouldn't like it, but he would concede the beach and concentrate his forces on the high ground. Now, those of you who understand, who've seen Star Wars a couple times, or you see maybe memes that are out there that talk about getting that high ground, that is classic military strategy. Get that high ground, get above them so you can see what's going on. Get uphill from them. You're almost 90% chance of success if you can get above them. Always take the high ground. It always gives you the advantage. Montgomery looked back toward the beach. What days ago had been empty shoreline now teemed with tents, vehicles, and army personnel. Farther off in the blue water of the Med, dozens of Allied ships of all sizes bobbed in the waves. Compared to what they had gone through in Sicily, this landing had gone smoothly. Hearing a low whistling sound, Montgomery returned his gaze to the distant mountains. It grew louder, heading straight for them. It was the unmistakable hum of artillery shell. It was soon joined in chorus by dozens of others. "Incoming," someone shouted. Montgomery's platoon scrambled to haul their gear and take whatever cover they could. The world around them exploded in noise and fire. The Germans had just announced their presence with authority. Montgomery knew instantly this wasn't going to be like Sicily. They wouldn't be facing poorly trained and ill-equipped Italian troops that had already given up. "Everybody dig in," he shouted. "I guess they know we're here." So like I said, I painted the picture of Saving Private Ryan where the guys get up on the shore, they get there, ramps drop, they come out, and they start getting pummeled with gunfire, right? That's obviously not what happens here. They're going out, they're taking artillery, they're firing mortars at them. Now, if you're not familiar with how mortars work, what they do, you may have seen them in movies or whatever. They've got this rocket-looking thing, right? They drop it in this tube, and then it just immediately fires it back out. What it does, it just lobs it up in the air, and what they have to do, they have to determine the distance by determining the correct angle of the mortar tube, fire it off, and then back then especially, you would hear the whistling sound, and that's where we get the whistling sound from like cartoons and things like that. That distant, right? That noise, that's that noise that you're going to hear. So as they're going into this and they're seeing this, they're hearing these things, they know mortars are coming. The fear, I've obviously never been in it. I've never been to that point where I've had mortars dropped on me. However, you talk to people that have, and you have a fear, there's just this incessant fear because You don't know what's coming next. You don't know where it's going to land. You don't know where it's going. No matter how much cover you take, you don't know if it's going to hit you next because it will come right on top of you. It can take out your bunker or whatever it is you're trying to hide in. It is just coming in. So all you can do is just wait and try to figure out if you can see it, if you can move. If you can't, you're kind of stuck right there. They started lobbing it. And if you think about it, the way that they land up on the beach, they have all these tents, they have all these people, they have groups of people that are sticking around in that area. What better way? Now they can sit there and start saying, good, you're now in one mass. Let's go ahead and start knocking those masses out with artillery. And if they're doing that, it's almost more beneficial to the enemy if they do that than just waiting to start firing rounds into the landing craft, because there's that chance that while you're firing on one, another one's coming up and you're going to miss that one, right? Why not get them while they're bunched up? That's a tactic that law enforcement officers use. You don't stand right next to your partner when you're going to a call. You don't walk in the same line. You stay away from them because you don't know where anything's coming from, where the next things come from. You got to be aware, which is something that Montgomery was looking at. He's thinking, okay, those guys, if I was going to do this, I would go up there. And I kind of skipped over a part where it talked about he got that field commission. That's not something they just give to anybody. You got to know your stuff. You got to be smart. You got to be tough. He was a platoon sergeant at that time. That's not somebody that's totally in charge. Lieutenants getting put in charge of platoons. However, they need a solid sergeant to help them keep the men in line, to kind of be that second in command, help them out. So that's what he was doing. He was capable of doing it. He knew what the lieutenant was going to need. So they lose a lieutenant and they give him that battlefield commission. Battlefield commissions still happen, however, they're pretty rare. And you're not going to see that too often with a lot of, now we have a lot. Back in Vietnam, we would do that. We would do those battlefield commissions. World War I, obviously, or World War II, we would obviously do it. Sure, World War I, yeah. But you look back now at Afghanistan, Iraq wars and stuff like that, we didn't do that much. We had plenty of lieutenants coming in. We were able to rotate people out. We have a lot better way of being able to determine how to get people the help they need immediately. We have better evacs. We have better ways of getting our guys in and out of places than we did back in World War II and Korea and Vietnam. But we look at it now when we sit there and say, okay, these guys were in a bad place. And for him to get up there and become a field commissioned lieutenant, it's not just by luck. This guy knew what was going on. You can tell by his thought process by saying, you know what? If I was the enemy, I'd be over there. I either need to start working my way up there to go see if there is anybody up there, or I need to get out of the way of what's going on. Unfortunately, he didn't get there in time. However, he knew where to look. So who was this guy? He was born near Long, Oklahoma, July 23rd, 1917. He grew up on a farm in Sequoia country, just west of the Arkansas border, where thousands of Cherokee had resettled in the 1830s after the U.S. government forcibly removed them from their lands in the southeastern U.S. Their forced march to Oklahoma came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Montgomery's mother was Cherokee, and at age 13, he and his three sisters attended Chillicothe Indian Agricultural School, a boarding school run by the federal government. He was an outstanding athlete because there were maybe 300 or 400 students in the school. He said, I started in the 7th grade and stayed throughout my sophomore year. In an interesting coincidence for such a small school, another Chillicothe student, Ernest Childers, would also be awarded the Medal of Honor in World War II. In 11th grade, he attended public high school in Carnegie, Oklahoma, where he lettered in basketball and football. Classmates described him as A kind, humorous, and outgoing young man, he showed great determination to finish what he started. According to one, his football prowess earned him a scholarship to Bacone College in Muskogee, a college that catered to Native American students. While Montgomery was a student at Bacone, he enrolled in the Oklahoma National Guard, joining the 1st Company of the 180th Infantry Regiment in 1937. The company was composed entirely, or almost entirely, of Native American students from Bacone. It was a way to make a little extra money during the Great Depression. Living in Oklahoma in 1930s was not easy for farming families like Montgomery's. America was in the middle of the worst economic disaster in the U.S. history. More than 20% of the nation's population was unemployed. Oklahoma was very hard to hit by this. The state was experiencing a prolonged drought, which killed the crops and dried up the top layer of dirt where crops grow and flourish. Winds swept and exposed topsoil in gigantic dust storms across the Great Plains. And prairie land in Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico became known as the Dust Bowl. Farmers lost their land and money. Oklahoma agricultural industry nearly died. These black blizzards sometimes traveled all the way to the East Coast. Circumstances were so bad that the Dust Bowl became a nationwide obsession. Newspapers ran front-page stories on the Oklahomans' plight. Movie theaters showed newsreels of the horrible condition. Thousands of starving, desperate Oklahomans abandoned the state and headed to California, looking for greater opportunity. It was one of the biggest voluntary mass migrations in American history. Those who left became known as Okies. Some of Montgomery's family left in beat-up trucks and old cars, or in any transportation they could find, riding on freight trains or hitchhiking. So many people traveled to California along Route 66 that author John Steinbeck dubbed it the Mother Road, the Road of Flight, in The Grapes of Wrath, in his 1939 novel about the plight of the poor farming family. In 1938, Montgomery headed to California too. After he earned his associate's degree at Bacone, he accepted a scholarship to the University of Redlands. There he continued to star on the football field and cemented his legend for toughness. During one game in famed Rose Bowl Stadium, a player on the opposing team burst through the Redlands defense and was on his way to an easy touchdown. Only one thing stood in his way. Number 22, Jack C. Montgomery. Montgomery tackled the ball player so hard that he left the man unconscious. The crowd was stunned, and one woman was said to have remarked, "Did that little old boy knock out that big man?" Montgomery earned his bachelor's degree in physical education in 1940, but with no plans to go after graduation, he returned to Oklahoma. He looked for a job as a teacher or a coach, but found he lacked the proper educational credits to teach. So he rejoined his old National Guard unit, completed his required 4 years of service, and was discharged as a sergeant in September 1941. America was finally emerging from the Great Depression, but the rest of the world was in turmoil. Japan had invaded China in 1937, destroying everything in its path as it marched through the countryside. Millions of Chinese citizens were killed during the onslaught. Now, if you look back, if you look at history, if you're interested in history at all, if you get a chance to look at the way that the Japanese went through like Shanghai and all that stuff, it is absolutely brutal how they were back in the 40s. It's almost as if it was a different type of person, different type of country than it is now. The way that they look at things, the way they do things now is it's reminiscent of their discipline and structure. However, it was so brutal. They didn't. If you were an enemy, you were an enemy to the death, no matter what. Japan was looking to expand its empire southward and became the dominant power in the Pacific. There's a great book by a woman named Iris Chen who writes about the Japanese going to Shanghai and the brutality that they showed. And that's just Shanghai. You haven't even gotten to the areas in which you're talking about the other areas in which they went through China, and that's just China. China's huge, and Japan wasn't that big. However, when you're so aggressive and so brutal like that, it doesn't matter. Like what happened earlier, what they talked about, that lady saying that little boy knock out that big man, that's the same thing. The aggression and the brutality that it's that saying, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. That's what was going on right now when the Japanese invaded China. In Europe, in 1939, Hitler had launched his Blitzkrieg in Poland. Indeed, the Germans were the first to use this tactic of striking targets quickly and without mercy. They would concentrate their planes, tanks, and artillery in a narrow front and drive a breach into the country's defenses. Armored tanks would quickly penetrate and drive freely behind the lines, causing chaos and disorganization. German planes would prevent any reinforcements, and soon opposing troops would be encircled and forced to surrender. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France all fell to these maneuvers and the might of the German army. July 1940, the German Luftwaffe began almost daily bombing runs on Great Britain to prepare for an invasion. The raids would go on for 3 months in an attempt to break the will of the nation. However, the British people, and especially the Royal Air Force, refused to give in during the Battle of Britain. No matter how many attacks the Germans launched, British fighter pilots of the Royal Air Force turned them back. Running short on fuel, planes, and supplies, the RAF pilots would fly missions after mission, taking time only to grab a quick meal while landing and refueling their aircraft before taking off to fight again. British bomber pilots were not idle. As Germany attacked, Britain retaliated, increasing its own bombing runs on an important target in territory the Germans had recently conquered, such as submarine bases and strategic ports along the coast of France. This is that whole thing that if you may have heard the famous speech of Winston Churchill's where he says, "We will defend our island, whatever the cost may be. Fight on the landing grounds and in the streets." That if you haven't heard it, just Google Churchill's speech. It's inspiring, and it motivated and moved the British people to say, not our island, we're not going to let these guys take over. Because like I said, they'd already seen what had happened, what had come in, and how they had taken over all these other countries in Europe. And Germany, it's not that big. You figure out all these other countries, they could band together and defend against it. They couldn't, not the way that they were fighting. And they were also looking at it like, what the heck? What are you doing? And then all of a sudden they would burst through those defenses and come on in, and they're like, you're our neighbor. Yeah, but we're taking over now because the way that Hitler looked at it. This was the world Jack Montgomery found himself in when he enlisted in the National Guard in September of 1941. There was no doubt the United States was gearing up for war, but the country was still divided. Many citizens wanted America to enter the war to help our allies, especially in Europe. Others were drastically opposed to any involvement. And we know how that turned out. Because soon came an event that changed everything. It united the country in a way it has seldom been before or since, and it caused Montgomery to re-enlist. We're talking obviously about December 7th, 1941, when Japan bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Using 350 aircraft, thousands of American sailors, soldiers, and Marines died. Hundreds of airplanes were damaged or destroyed, and all of the battleships in port were targeted. 2 were completely lost. The next day, President Roosevelt asked Congress for the declaration of war against Japan. His request was granted. Days later, Japan Japan's allies in the Axis, Italy and Germany, declared war on the United States. Like it or not, America was at war, as was much of the rest of the world. It is often said that there was a Japanese admiral that was a little beside himself when they had bombed Pearl Harbor and they had done all the damage that they did, because what he was afraid that he said we may have just waken a sleeping giant, which is true. It was said that every American, it was at least thought throughout the world that every American had a gun, because every one of us would go out hunting or would go do something like that, and they assumed that that was going to be the most difficult place to go and try to take over and try to kind of invade and stuff like that. And we've got solid defenses. We've got the ocean, we got ocean on either side, and we've got friendly allies on either top and bottom. We're not a country in which it's going to be easy to invade. And they knew that. They knew that. They had to hit our little fringe areas, our Hawaii, and I'm surprised they didn't go after Alaska or something along those lines. However, there's not much in Alaska that they would be able to get into. But we had a large number of ships, and we put everything in port. And you can do a lot of research on the logistics and the tactics of that hit. But it's amazing how that united the country, put us in that same place where we said, you know what? We are all on board for taking this back to those people who decided to come and attack us just for being here. Even the people that were opposed to it said, you know what? We need to still go against these people. We still need to go. I agree. We need to go to war, if nothing else, to get revenge for our brothers. But if we don't stop this now, they're coming to our front door, and they're going to try to hit us hard and kill us that way. It's not something that was easy to understand for some people. Other people, there's no problem. They get it. They get it. And they said, you know what? I'm going and I'm enlisting as well. And everybody, not everybody, a large majority of people, men, women, whatever, said, you know what? My duty is to serve the country and do my part. And so guys enlisted. Sure, some women enlisted. Majority of them stayed home because they had kids still to take care of. They would go work in the factories, developing the armaments, the ammunition, the things that we needed to go fight this war. And these guys everybody was doing it. Kids were getting things, getting in it so they're getting metal so they could go make bullets, and they can make ammunition, and they can make more rifles and weapons and things like that. People were donating these things for the war effort so that we can go out and fight these people that were doing it. Once Japan attacked us, we said we're going to war with Japan. Their buddy said, okay, hey, if they're at war with them, I guess you're at war with us. So now we have to fight 3 countries, one of which had already taken over the majority of Europe and was aiming for our biggest, strongest ally in Great Britain. Going back to Anzio, as the trees exploded close to the Allied positions, the impact of the shells were so powerful that the trees were obliterated, instantly turning into thousands of tiny wooden projectiles. When soldiers were injured, they were sent to an aid station. These stations were located on the beach behind the Allied lines. Soldiers returning from the aid station would remark on how heavy the shell was at the rear, or how heavy the shelling was at the rear. Many men asked not to be sent to the rear. Even if they were wounded, they felt safer on the front. The artillery barrage was unrelenting. German artillery hurled shells from up to 18 miles away. As Montgomery thought, they had chosen their defensive positions well. They were dug in, hidden in the hills, and it gave them a huge advantage. The enemy wasn't the only challenge facing Montgomery and his platoon. Many problems were created by the nature of the war itself. British and American soldiers made up the bulk of the Allied forces. This meant that leaders from both sides wanted to have a say in plotting military strategy, allocating the troops and resources, and deciding the priorities and plan of attack. The invasion of Italy was the first time since the start of the war that American troops had landed on the European continent. Adolf Hitler, after conquering so much territory, boasted that he had created fortress Europe, and no Allied troops would ever dare set foot on European soil again. We know later that his boast was nothing more than hollow words, because he wasn't able to maintain that. His ego, his arrogance was so big that he was not able to maintain that threat, that belief that he may have had. Allied troops first fought together in North Africa, where they faced German forces under the command of Field Marshal Rommel. Rommel led the German forces to great success on the battlefield. When the Americans arrived, a quick victory eluded them. Their army was largely made up of recently activated National Guard units and fresh recruits. The German troops were combat trained and far more experienced. Now you got to think, we didn't have a solid army like we have now back then. The majority of what we had were National Guard units, who were those guys that would be in that for each state. They would be the ones that would be up front. They would be the ones that was what the army pretty much consisted of. And they had their general armies, the general United States Army. But in this case, at the time, they didn't have a ton of just soldiers training, bases all over the place. It was mostly National Guard. So when these guys get out there, they're guys that had been, farming or whatever on the regular job, and they went part-time and did their job in the army, and then went back to their regular job, whether it was being a teacher or a farmer or a plumber or whatever it was that they did. Here's what the book says about that. This is the 45th Infantry Division of the United States Army. Was started as a National Guard unit from the American Southwest and included many Native Americans from Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Oklahoma. Before the United States entered World War II in 1941, the country did not have a large standing professional military. In 1940, only about 400,000 men served in the Army and Navy, making it the 18th largest military in the world. However, each state had its own National Guard controlled by the governor. During natural disasters or civil unrest, such as riots or strikes or those sorts of things, the National Guard was often deployed to keep order and help rescue victims. When necessary, the U.S. government could federalize National Guard units, temporarily making them a part of the U.S. military. The 45th Division became known as the Thunderbird Division because of its insignia was a thunderbird, a powerful spirit in the form of a bird that holds tremendous importance in the lore of many American native people. Depicted in yellow on a red background, the Thunderbird made a distinctive shoulder patch on the uniform and was a tremendous source of pride. Montgomery was proud to be a part of the Thunderbirds. When he rejoined the division after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he knew many of the men in his company from his previous stint in the unit. It was good to be going to war with familiar faces. The division's motto was Semper Anticus, Latin for always forward. Men like Montgomery lived by the motto. All of them were good soldiers, dependable. he said. If you went forward and said to somebody, cover me, you never looked back. Montgomery returned to the unit as a sergeant. He reported to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where the 45th Infantry Division was sent to begin basic combat training. The morale was strong in the Thunderbirds. In the 45th, there wasn't any problem between the Indians and the whites. Montgomery later said, in 1941, I Company of the 180th Regiment was an entirely Indian company that consisted of students from Bacone College. The captain was white, and the first lieutenant was Indian. In 1941, there were 5 Indian sergeants in I Company and 180th that got direct commissions. July 10, 1943, the 45th Division would put its training to the test. It had been decided the U.S., British, and Canadian troops would launch an amphibious attack on Sicily, which we covered earlier in the podcast. Montgomery would get his first taste of combat doing this. It would be treacherous. It would be a treacherous landing. The Germans were expected to be putting up a ferocious defense. But no one, not even Montgomery, knew yet that the Germans had fallen into a trap that helped pave the way to an Allied victory. It was a brilliant deception, planned and executed by British military intelligence. And so it kind of goes into a spy story in regards to that, how before the invasion, the British intelligence officers created an elaborate ruse to hide the location of the attack, and they figured, if we can do a couple of these things by placing a dead body here and having some specific paperwork, false paper spread around, we'll be able to kind of put this ruse on. And it was actually orchestrated by the man who would later create James Bond. And it was called Operation Mincemeat. The deception was an exercise in counterintelligence. It was highly delicate and the complicated plan to fool Germany into believing the Allies would attack near Greece in the eastern Mediterranean. Hitler and his generals could be fooled into believing this lie, or if they could be fooled into believing this lie, they would be forced to move troops and equipment from Sicily, and it would be much easier for the Allies to take the island. The island would give the Allies control of the vital shipping lanes. Since most men and materials were moved by ship, it would be a huge tactical advantage in the war. The concept for Operation Mincemeat came from an idea suggested in 1939 by Ian Fleming, who was an assistant to the head of British Naval Intelligence at the time. More than a decade before he would publish his first novel about James Bond, Fleming was doing his part for the war effort. It was his job to help develop counterintelligence plans. One idea he wrote to his superiors was based on the hoax he had read in a detective story, that they would take a corpse dressed as an airman with dispatches in his pockets. He could be dropped on the coast, supposedly from a parachute that had failed. He further said, I understand there was no difficulty in obtaining corpses at the Naval Hospital, but of course, it would have to be a fresh one. So they put this whole thing together, they get it on there, enough that they had this thing dressed up, this corpse dressed up, with papers, with dispatches in his pocket, that it looked like one of their men, one of the German men, or even one of ours, that they were able to say, hey, this is what's going on, this is where they're going, we can adjust our troops this way. And the Germans said, okay, they're going to do this. We will adjust that way as well. The biggest problem was how to make sure the body got into German hands. The book further says, again, British counterintelligence was ready. In 1941, the British had decrypted Germany's Enigma code, which allowed them to decipher radio transmissions and learn what the Germans were discussing and planning. British intelligence knew that Spain, which claimed to be neutral in the war, was in truth collaborating with Nazi Germany. So the decision was made to drop the body off the shores of Spain. If Spanish officials found the body convincing, they would turn the papers over to the Germans for inspection. It's also a way to figure out who your friends are and who your enemies are. If Spain's sitting there trying to be, oh, no, hey, we're not on anybody's team, and then all of a sudden the Germans have the information, we know who we can trust, right? So on April 30, 1943, a sardine fisherman found the body floating off the shore of Huelva, Spain. Authorities were called in, and the Spaniards and Germans took the bait. The documents were passed all the way up to Hitler. He moved troops and equipment to reinforce his positions in Greece and the Balkans. His generals and the Italian dictator Mussolini failed to convince him that Sicily was the logical place for the Allies to attack. The briefcase was eventually returned to the British naval attaché in Spain, who sent it back to England. To completely sell the fake plan, the British sent an unencrypted cable back, saying that experts had examined the envelopes and found no evidence of tampering. The attaché was instructed to express Britain's deepest appreciation for the care the Spaniards took, and was permitted to tell them in confidence that one of the documents was of utmost importance. The naval attaché was in on the ruse, of course, and a second secret cable informed him that the letters had indeed been opened. He casually spread the word that the British believed the envelopes had not been tampered with, knowing his falsehood would reach German ears. And what of the body? Who was the body? Where did they get this guy? Glyndwr Michael, a poor homeless laborer, was buried in Huelva, Spain. His tombstone credits his service as Major William Martin, R.M. His role in deceiving the German high command was instrumental in the triumph of the Sicily invasion, thus making Operation Mincemeat a total success. These guys went out of their way. They made this whole thing, set it up so those guys could get up on the beach in Sicily. They could get there. They can do what they needed to do without any resistance, per se. Obviously, they were way up in those mountains like we talked about earlier. But had they not set this up, prepped it for the guys to go get on the beach, they would have met heavy resistance, just like you see in, like I said, Saving Private Ryan. Back inside the book, Scogliti, Sicily, July 10, 1943. 7 months before Montgomery and his platoon went ashore on Anzio. They were landing in Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, codenamed Operation Husky. The Allied attack on the Italian territory was a massive invasion. 150,000 soldiers, 3,000 ships, and 4,000 aircraft. Patton commanded the U.S. forces, and General Bernard Montgomery led the British troops. General Bernard Montgomery is also known as Monty. If you look into his stories, the things that he did, the way that his men looked at him, they saw him as the Patton of these guys, of the British Army. They're always talking about, oh, Monty. This guy came up as field marshal and the whole thing. He was in World War I. He was a fantastic soldier. If you get a chance to learn anything about Monty. Obviously, we all know Patton. At least we should. If we don't, we should be looking into it. But the invasion force landed on the southern shores of Sicily, a hilly island about the size of Vermont, dominated on the northeast by Mount Etna at 11,000 feet, the highest active volcano in Europe. In a brilliant stroke of strategy, the Allied commanders went through with the invasion despite gale force winds that whipped up high seas during the night. The German and Italian defenders figured there was little possibility of an enemy landing in such horrible weather, but the first assault waves hit the beaches before dawn. They found little resistance. It wasn't just high seas that kept their opponents' forces unprepared. The success of Operation Mincemeat had resulted in the removal of large numbers of German troops and armor. The Axis forces were waiting for the Allies to attack in Greece. With the seas so rough, the initial landing had caught the remaining German and Italian troops by surprise. The high seas and rolling swells particularly affected Montgomery's 180th Regiment. Landing teams were scattered across 12 miles when their planned landing zone was supposed to be less than 2 miles long. This left 2 of the regiment's battalions disorganized and undermanned when they faced the only serious opposition to the landings. The 180th lost 30 lives, more than half the Allied soldiers who died on Sicily that day. By that afternoon, all 150,000 Allied troops were ashore, along with 600 tanks. It was the first amphibious landing by the Allies in Europe since the start of the war. In this case, the tension for the majority of the Allied attackers was heightened, as they had expected heavy resistance. When that didn't happen, they worried about where the Germans were hiding. From the beaches near Scogliti, the 45th Division rolled inland in the coming days, capturing the towns of Victoria and Ragusa. Part of its assignment was to take the airfields at Comiso and Biscari. With hundreds of planes and huge stores of ammunition, the airfields were important strategic targets. At Biscari, the 180th Regiment encountered stiff resistance. The airfield was crawling with Germans. Snipers and machine gunners in the grounded aircraft turned their weapons on the approaching invaders. The Allied forces led by the 45th took control of the airfield, but not before the German and Italian forces regrouped and launched a violent counterattack. Fighting was intense, but the enemy forces were finally repelled. From the airfield onward, the fighting was nearly nonstop. The 45th was up against the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. Göring was one of Hitler's most trusted military advisors. The troops were well trained and would not be defeated easily. Over the next few weeks, the forward progress of the 45th was arduous. Much of the fighting was close combat, sometimes hand-to-hand, with Germans and American soldiers grappling amid the rocks and dirt. When ammunition ran out, they raised knives and entrenching tools as weapons. An officer in the 45th recalled seeing one of his men battering a German soldier with his helmet. Inch by bloody inch, the 45th Division crawled and clawed northward. The number of casualties mounted as the Thunderbirds fought their way across the volcanic island. Before long, Montgomery found himself in charge of the platoon as other commanders were wounded or killed in action. For the next few months, he was right in the thick of the fighting. "I took charge of the platoon for the rest of the campaign in Sicily," he said. "When it was over, they recommended me for a battlefield commission. I got it the day before we went to Salerno." Montgomery was promoted to second lieutenant. The conduct of Montgomery and the men of the 45th Division pushed the German and Italian troops off Sicily. It was a major victory, and as in North America, took conquered territory away from Hitler and Germany. Patton singled out the 45th Division with a special praise. The 45th Division, a green outfit, went into combat with 2 veteran outfits and asked for no favors, made no mistakes. They kept up with the other outfits. I'm proud of every officer and man in that division. In little over a month, the Allies drove the Axis forces off Sicily. On August 17, 1943, when the Allies reached the port of Messina on the northern tip of the island, less than 2 miles from the Italian mainland, they discovered that the Germans had pulled thousands of soldiers across the water, reinforcing their position for the Allied invasion they now knew was coming. For their victory on Sicily, the Allies paid a heavy cost. Nearly 30,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. They put up such a fight. They put up such a battle against these guys that it was hard won. But it was important. It was an important, as far as you look at strategy and figuring out where we need to go so we can get supplies, troops, we can get them to where we need them to be, so we can kind of come in with that pincers movement. We have the D-Day invasion coming up. If we can get troops coming up through Sicily, we're going to be able to all move towards Berlin and start squeezing the Germans from both sides. Now, Hitler had a thing where he would say, "Oh, we're going to send troops here. We're going to send troops here," and his men were so many yes men in his outfit. They were afraid to say, "We don't have those kinds of guys. We don't have those people to this regiment that you're talking about. Either they're killed, or they've been taken prisoner, or they just don't exist. But Hitler refused to listen to that. And so what would happen is that we start having troops coming in. If we have our troops coming in from Sicily, we have the other folks coming in from France. And then we have Russians coming in from Russia, coming in from the east. We're pinching those guys right in the center, and he can't fight all those battles on all those fronts. However, he thought he could. His generals, his military advisors were trying to tell him, you can't do that. And yet he didn't listen to them, which was ultimately the reason for his downfall. But we're going to get into that in a little bit. But during the Sicily campaign, the 45th Division proved to be a formidable fighting force despite its inexperience. Over the first 5 days of fighting, the 45th Division captured substantial Axis resources, which included 15,000 small arms, 10 million rounds of ammunition, 700 machine guns, 38 artillery pieces, 49 trucks, 160 aircraft, 44 tanks, 222,000 gallons of fuel, and 5,000 soldiers. They took that all away from them that they were using to block the advancement from Italy straight up to Berlin. Because of this fight, because of the things that these guys went through, the 45th went through, and Montgomery's men, and that's Jack Montgomery, not to be confused with, I was talking about Monty before. If I'm going to talk about Montgomery, the general, I'll call him Monty. In this case, I'm talking about Montgomery, Jack Montgomery, who this book is about. They'd been tested, and they'd been proven that they were up to the task. The experience they gained on Sicily would serve them well because they were coming up on Anzio. With a complete victory in Sicily, the Allies turned to mainland Italy. But the invasion did not happen easily. Over the preceding months, the United States and its allies could not agree on the proper course of action. Churchill desperately wanted a follow-up invasion of the mainland. The U.S. was looking ahead to the invasion of France in the spring of 1944. Like I said, D-Day. Churchill believed that the time to strike the soft underbelly of Europe, so he called it, was right now. Doing so would force Hitler to respond by bringing more troops and supplies to Italy. It would also force him to pull troops from France, where they expected an Allied invasion, or from the Soviet Union, where the Soviet army had started to beat back the German invaders, causing them to retreat as well. Once again, like I said, they're beating them, they're pushing them from the east. Montgomery's forces are pushing them from the south, and we got D-Day planned to come in to push them from the west. Though they agreed that Hitler had overextended himself, the United States was reluctant to land on mainland Italy. There were a number of reasons why. First were the several 100,000 German troops already in Italy. The 65,000 soldiers who managed to escape the Allies in Sicily now reinforced the mainland German troop positions. Number two was a problem with geography. Away from the coastal areas, the terrain in southern Italy is rugged and mountainous. In wintry conditions, this terrain is even more challenging. And number three were lessons from Italy's own history. Many times over, the Italian peninsula had been overrun by invaders, but successful invasion of Italy did not come from the sea. They originated from the north and came through the mountains passes of the Alps. Even the great General Hannibal chose to attack by land in 218 BC, rather than take the direct route across the sea from Carthage to North America or to North Africa. As Napoleon said to advise, Italy is shaped like a boot, and it must be entered the same way from the top. They're looking at how this goes. The other side of it that comes to my mind that I'm thinking about is these guys are entering an Axis country. The way D-Day's coming in, they're coming from an Allied country, from France. Sure, it's been invaded, but the majority of French people and the people that are there are are allies. The only resistance they have is the invading army. Unlike Italy, that country is an Axis power. Are they going to be able to trust or know that they're not going to be attacked by the citizenry of Italy? Italy's hilly interior gives defenders too much of an advantage. Invaders trying to attack from the sea would be exposed on the flat coastal plains. Defenders could set up artillery on the high grounds a few miles inland and hurl shell after shell at any forces attempting to land on the coast. The attackers would be sitting ducks. In spite of the danger, Churchill pressured the U.S. commanders to strike and sent pleas to President Roosevelt. Churchill was desperate to capture Rome. Doing so, he believed, would further undermine the Axis alliance of Germany, Italy, and Japan. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific War against the Japanese, U.S. forces were retaking island after island and driving the Japanese back toward their homeland. By capturing the eternal city of Rome, Churchill knew the Allies would send a message to the world that the Axis powers had been weakened in Europe as well. And so these guys go back and forth, and they're trying to figure out, if we did this, we're going to tip the scales this way. If we go this way, this is going to happen. But since the 1920s, Italy had been under the control of dictator Benito Mussolini. For years, Mussolini had been a key ally of Hitler. While the Italian army was not well trained or equipped as a fighting force, the Axis partnership with Mussolini gave Hitler a buffer to his south and access the shipping lanes of the Med. But the Allies made headway in Sicily. The political situation in Italy was thrown into chaos. Mussolini's fascist ministers stripped him of his powers, allowing King Victor Emmanuel to remove him as prime minister. Mussolini was arrested and imprisoned in an isolated ski resort in northern Italy. The new prime minister secretly sent word to the Allied forces that he wished to negotiate a truce. Italy formally surrendered to the Allied powers on September 3rd, 1943. So even with that happening, they decided, you know what, we're still going to go ahead and we're going to still invade Italy. Even though I know Churchill wants to, what Churchill wanted, right? If we can just go and do this. So the secret armistice with the new government in Rome was an important step. As the Allies planned to invade mainland Italy, they wanted to reduce the number of opposing forces. After the Italians surrendered on 3 September, British forces crossed the Strait of Messina from Sicily into mainland Italy. 6 days later, the 45th Division made the first U.S. landings on mainland Italy near Salerno. They encountered heavy resistance from German troops and heavy armor as they thrust inland. The brutal fighting went on for weeks. It was during this campaign that Montgomery earned a Silver Star, the third highest decoration for bravery in combat. He said, "I was supposed to set up this roadblock about 2 miles in front of where the rest of the battalion was. The last order was that the battalion and the regiment were going to move forward at daylight, and the British were supposed to be on our right flank. When it got daylight, we saw the crossroads and the Germans that were holding it. We were up above them, and we opened fire. We surprised them completely for about 15 or 20 minutes. We had a big firefight. We only had about 2 or 3 people wounded. They were able to walk out. We found out later from the Italians around there that there were about 200 German troops in that area, and we were almost completely surrounded. I didn't know that then, but we surprised them so much that they took off." Fighting continued through December before reinforcements arrived, and the exhausted troops were pulled back to Salerno from the front lines after 72 days of continuous combat. They had pushed the Germans 100 miles back through mountainous terrain and treacherous weather. The Germans were entrenched in the mountains of Italy along the Gustav Line. They had established artillery positions, and they were reinforced by nearly 65,000 troops that had retreated from Sicily. Once again, the Allies debated the next step in the invasion of Italy. Churchill pushed hard for capturing Rome. Patton and Eisenhower argued that Rome held little strategic value. In the end, the decision was made to launch Operation Shingle and land Allied forces behind enemy lines at Anzio. Allied planners decided that the Italian seaside resort of Anzio was an ideal geographical option for an amphibious attack, 75 miles north of the heavily fortified Gustav Line. The wide beaches with shallow approaches would allow the landing craft to make it to shore. The roads out of Anzio would give immediate access to the main thoroughfares leading to Rome, about 30 miles north. And Anzio landing would also draw German troops away from the Gustav Line, which another Allied force would try to breach as well. The Allied forces took the Germans completely by surprise at Anzio. Enemy guns stayed eerily silent. One private reported, "It ain't right, but I like it." And this is where we were at before when we were talking about they had landed on the beaches. Some were on landing craft, some were on boats, and they just get up there. They're expecting resistance and nothing. And then that is that part where we got up and we were talking about how how Montgomery was looking at the hills and said, if I was going to do this, I would want to be up there. So he starts moving up there, and that's when they start getting shelled by mortars. The Allied forces took the Germans completely by surprise at Anzio. Enemy guns stayed eerily silent. By the night of January 22nd, 1944, 36,000 soldiers had come ashore, but instead of driving inland with the element of surprise on their side, the Allied commanders chose to build up their supplies and only cautiously pushed a few miles inland. This decision would come back to haunt them, as it allowed the Germans to bring up reinforcements. The Germans had readily dispatched units south from Rome and several more from Yugoslavia, France, and Germany. In the coming days, the fighting grew fierce, with the Allies unable to get off the beachhead. The Germans would surround the Allied forces and pin them down for 4 months with nearly continuous shelling. Both sides would take heavy casualties as the Allies tried to fight their way out. The delay and subsequent stalemate caused Churchill to remark, "I had hoped that we were hurling a wildcat onto the shore, but all we had got was a stranded whale." The Thunderbirds 180th Regiment, with Lieutenant now Montgomery, landed at Anzio on 30 July. As always, an amphibious landing was fraught with peril, and by now the Germans were readily and regularly shelling and strafing the area. That's one of those things that they said, you know what? We got this. We're going to do it. We're going to, more or less, we're going to half-ass this. They rested on their laurels. Sure enough, they got their butts handed to them. Nat Crandall, a private assigned to the 180th, described what it was like to ride a landing craft onto the beach during the amphibious landing. The LST had a flat open deck and a superstructure for crew and controls on one side. My buddy Ernie Friedman and I were positioned on the shade of the superstructure watching huge geysers of water shoot skyward. We didn't yet realize that we were being shelled by what later became famously known as the Anzio Express, a very large caliber cannon mounted on the rail flat car that receded into a tunnel in the mountain when attacked by the Allied forces. The explosions were enormous. Despite their own reinforcements, the Allies lost momentum. What followed was an ugly, vicious style of war, similar to the trench warfare of World War I. The Thunderbirds dug in, living 4 weeks at a time in foxholes and trenches. The area around them was marshy and damp, and the foxhole often filled with water. In addition to the Germans, disease became another enemy. A condition known as trench foot sent many soldiers to the rear. Now, trench foot was one of those things that was that knocked people off their feet, literally. It wasn't developed in World War I. However, the name was coined in World War I when they'd be in the trenches. They'd be filled with water. They would get their boots, their socks, their feet would get wet. Basically, what happened is the feet would stay wet. They would stay damp. Feet need to dry. You need to take your boots off. You need to take your socks off. One of the biggest things that killed soldiers and hurt soldiers and everything from World War I to Korea, Vietnam, was disease. It wasn't always battle. Sometimes it was disease. And so basically trench foot, it causes so much pain because it keeps your feet wet. Your feet don't have a chance to dry like it needs to. And what happens is now you get all this fungus that grows in there or whatever based off of the wetness. Your skin starts to decay in there and the skin can start peeling off. The blisters, they start staying in there. There's infection. There's all this other problem that occurs because of that. And it was always like near the beach, near where water was. That's why it's important. If you're going to get out there, if there's a point, if your feet are going to be wet and you have the opportunity to change your shoes, change your socks, do that. Take that opportunity to change those, because if they stay wet, your feet are going to start failing you. And you can't have your feet fail you, because if you have that, you might as well be immobile. It's like having no wheels for your car. Your feet need to be able to work. Keeping them dry is an important step in doing that. It was a serious issue in World War I, which is fought in the trenches, like I said. Soldiers had to dry their feet each day and change their socks regularly. They were paired with partners to check each other's feet. To keep their feet out of the water, they would try to find wood and other materials to line the bottom of the foxholes. Because they're sitting in there. They're in those foxholes for days and days on end, and they're starting to fill up with water. And if they're filling up with water, they're getting wet. They got to do something. They've got to keep their feet dry, or else they're going to get sick. They're going to die from that, and not from Germans shooting them. But not only did Germans just keep attacking by shelling them, but they also used aerial bombings and ground troops. Neither side could gain any advantage. Montgomery's platoon slowly reduced in number. Their fellow soldiers were wounded, fell ill, were captured, or were killed in action. By February, the platoon of normally 40 men was down to about 20 capable fighters. At some point, one side would have to figure out who was going to win. However, Montgomery and the rest of the Thunderbirds were determined not to blink. No matter how hard the Germans battered the division, the men held the line. And on a February day, Montgomery would achieve his Medal of Honor moment. Pataglione, Italy, February 22, 1944. The fighting had been going on for weeks. The clashing infantry units of the Allied and German forces had blended into a long, twisting, confusing line of men and deadly machines. The Germans' attacks were frequent and furious. Still, Montgomery and the Thunderbirds of the 45th refused to bend. Nothing the Germans threw at them was successful. Both sides turned their artillery loose to full effect. The bombardments went on for hours. Shells landed from all directions. The Germans unleashed their rocket artillery, the Nebelwerfer. The shells fired by this weapon made a distinctive wailing sound as they flew. The noise was so unnerving, soldiers gave them the nickname Screaming Mimes. Both sides were taking heavy casualties. Much of the fighting happened after sundown. Many times, soldiers from one side or the other would survive an attack at night, only to find at daybreak that the lines had shifted and they were now behind the enemy. These lost soldiers hid or played dead until the darkness returned and they could try to make their way back to their units. In the early morning hours of 22 February, Jack Montgomery and his platoon found themselves on the tip of the Allied lines near the village of Pataglione. As the sun rose, they discovered that the Germans were close. So close, in fact, they were dug in with 4 machine guns and a mortar just a short 50 yards away from Montgomery's men. Another machine gun nest was 100 yards away, and at 300 yards was a house occupied by German soldiers with yet another machine gun. As Montgomery recalled, the terrain was kind of flat. It was a little after daylight. My platoon was supposed to have about 40 people, but we were down to 20. We were on I Company's left flank, and there was a road between us and the company to our left. Montgomery analyzed the tactical situation. There were 1 or 2 houses there that hadn't been all locked down yet, but nobody was living in them. The Germans were around one of those houses, and they just got closer to us than they should have. I was looking to see where they were and what they were doing. I had no intention of doing what the Army said I did. What Montgomery did next would result in him being awarded that Medal of Honor. He instructed his men to shelter behind a stone wall. He eased himself into a small ravine, crawling to within hand grenade distance of the first machine gun nest. I was always going somewhere I didn't have any business going, he said later. I told my platoon to cover me, and I went out there. When you did that, you never looked back. You knew that as long as they're alive, they'll be looking out for you. His trust in the men of his platoon and of the Thunderbirds division was absolute. When he was in range of the closest machine gun, he climbed on a little mound and opened fire. As the Germans fell for cover, he stood up, fully exposed, and threw his grenades, killing 8 of the enemy and capturing 4 who surrounded it. Returning to the platoon with his prisoners, Montgomery gathered more grenades and set his sights on the second machine gun nest. He also called for artillery fire on the house in the meantime. Once again, his men covered him while he re-entered the ditch to attack the second target. And attack it he did, killing 3 enemy soldiers. His gunfire was so accurate that the remaining 7 Germans immediately surrendered. Now he returned his attention to the house. There was no ditch or other concealment in the flat open ground between him and the building. After the artillery barrage stopped, Montgomery ran towards the house. There was no place to hide. To him it didn't matter, as he threw his grenades and laid down deadly gunfire. As German soldiers ran from the house, they threw up their hands and surrendered. He took 32 prisoners that morning. There were 11 enemy dead and an unknown number of wounded. The main thing as far as Lieutenant Montgomery was concerned was that his platoon was safe from the withering fire of the enemy machine guns. The men of his platoon were awestruck by what Lieutenant Montgomery had done. In safeguarding them, he had single-handedly taken out 3 enemy positions, posing a direct threat. Montgomery had fought like a demon to protect his platoon. That night, artillery fire from both sides started up again. He continued by saying, I went over to a different company to see how they were doing. I was coming back alone through a big ditch when a shell hit. Montgomery suffered shrapnel wounds in his left leg, right arm, and chest. It wasn't very long before my medic found me. I didn't remember his first name, but his last name was Beetle. Your medic was one person that you had to have confidence in. I knew Beetle would find me. Montgomery was taken to the shore hospital. His wounds were serious, and he was scheduled to evacuate on a medical ship to Naples. However, the ship came under fire by German gunners and left without him. Lieutenant Montgomery remained at the shore hospital. He found that experience to be much scarier than any combat he had seen. The hospital was just tents, and the tents had holes in them from all the enemy artillery and mortar fire. When an attack started, I'd roll off the cot and hit the floor. I told them, dig me a hole here. It wasn't long before they were digging holes for everyone. They finally sent me back to Naples. From there, he was eventually shipped home. When I got back to the States, it was a year and a day since I had left. Lieutenant Jack C. Montgomery was out of the fight, but he had given his all, above and beyond the call of duty. Montgomery's fight had been over, but the war went on. The men in the Thunderbirds Division would continue pressing the fight against the German army. In the interior of Italy, south of Anzio, Allied forces finally broke through the Gustav Line. On 11 May 1944, they raced north toward the stalemate on the beachhead as Germans began withdrawing toward Rome. Early in the morning of 23 May, the Thunderbirds, along with 6 other divisions and the beachhead, attacked. 2 days of fierce fighting later, they were out and headed for Rome, joining up with the Allied forces from the south. The 45th chased the enemy north, yet the Germans' rear guard fought desperately, and some of the most bitter fighting in the entire campaign took place during their retreat. Rome fell to the Allies on June 5, 1944, the day before D-Day invasion at Normandy in France. The 45th Division was pulled from the front and placed in reserve. Since Sicily, it had been in combat for 281 days. Now think about that. That's more than 2/3 of a year just to be fighting, just continuous fighting. You're in trenches, you're in bad weather, you're going through the winter, you're going through all these times, you're seeing your buddies die, you're being replenished with new troops who you didn't land with. Your leader is no longer there. The guys they started with was not the same guys that they ended with. The division has to maintain, but it's not the same guys. There might be a small number of guys that are the same all the way through, but for the most part, on something like this, the guys that landed, the guys that started out, weren't all the same guys, but the division maintained, and those new guys learned from the old guys as they replaced them. Some of these guys, however, went all the way through that whole time. On August 15, 1944, the 45th undertook a 4th amphibious assault, landing on the south of France. The division plowed north through the Rhone Valley as the German army fought, delaying their defensive actions. The Thunderbirds occasionally ran into stiff resistance, but for much of the way, they pushed the tired German army back with ease. Several months, with only brief periods of rest, the division fought its way more than 600 miles north through France. On 17 March 1945, the Thunderbirds entered Germany, smashing through the Siegfried Line, the fortified defense wall that stretched along the German border from Switzerland to the Netherlands. In April, the 45th was part of the Allied force that liberated Dachau, the first of thousands of prison camps established by the Nazis. At least 32,000 inmates perished at the forced labor camp over a course of the war, and many thousands more died after passing through Dachau to Nazi extermination camps. U.S. troops were shocked at what they found. James A. Rose, an Ohio soldier from the 42nd Infantry Division, recounted, "I seen thousands of people crowding out that looked like skeletons with skin stretched on them. They were dirty, they smelled, and just one look at them, some of them half dead. Something happened that we realized that this war was all about. We know now why we were participating in this war." From there, the 45th pushed on to Munich and took that major city with plans to drive onward, but Germany surrendered on 7 May 1945 and the war in Europe was over. After 511 days of combat, the Thunderbirds of the 45th Division returned to the U.S. in September, a month after victory over Japan was declared. The Thunderbirds assembled at Camp Bowie, Texas, to begin deactivation. A year later, the division was reorganized as part of the Oklahoma National Guard. Once he came home to the United States, Lieutenant Montgomery underwent multiple surgeries. Doctors were uncertain if he would ever be able to walk again. However, after a lengthy recovery, Montgomery returned to active duty and was sent to Camp Walters in Texas in late 1944. He had over 30 inches of scars caused by the shrapnel, some of it still in his body. While at Camp Walters, he received a letter from the company clerk asking if he had received his Medal of Honor. Montgomery was puzzled, but paid it little mind until he was summoned to the White House. On January 15, 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt presented Lieutenant Jack C. Montgomery with the nation's highest military honor. His mother and siblings were in attendance. Montgomery later remembered his nervousness standing next to the president's desk in the Oval Office. "I bet my fingerprints are still on that desk. I squeezed it so hard," he said. After being discharged from the service in September, Montgomery returned to Oklahoma for many years. He worked for the VA in Muskogee and other nearby towns. In addition to the Medal of Honor, Montgomery was also the recipient of the Silver Star for valor and 2 Purple Hearts in recognition of being twice wounded in action. He had also been hit by German shrapnel during the Salerno campaign in late 43. Always modest, Montgomery spoke very little of his exploits on the battlefield. One day, the woman he would soon marry noticed something hanging on his office wall and asked him what it was. He dismissed it with, "Oh, that's just something I did back during the war." That something was his Medal of Honor. "I was just doing the job I was supposed to be doing," he would say whenever the subject of his medal came up. Like most of those who are decorated with a Medal of Honor, he didn't consider himself heroic. The heroes were the ones who didn't come home. "I got lucky," he said. Jack C. Montgomery passed away on June 11, 2002, in Muskogee, Oklahoma, at the age of 84. Today, the VA Medical Center in Muskogee is named in his honor. Semper Anticus. Always forward. Like Jack said, he was just doing the job he was supposed to be doing. He didn't consider himself heroic. The heroes were the ones who didn't come home. He got lucky. He put everything out there. He took prisoners and he killed men that were trying to kill his people, that were trying to kill those that were trying to keep invading armies from continuing to invade. This man, this hero, put everything he could out there for other people. And we could all just remember that mindset, that I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm just doing not what's expected of me, but what I'm supposed to do. A lot of times we go through this world, I'm just going to do what I'm supposed to do. I'm doing this so my boss doesn't get mad at me. I'm doing this because that's what's trying not to get in trouble. No, he looked at that as his duty as an American citizen. I was just doing what I'm supposed to be doing. This is what I'm supposed to be. This is what God put me on this planet for. To help these forces move forward against this invading evil army. But the picture was even bigger. And if you notice what that other soldier had said when helping free the prisoners of Dachau, he said that was what the war was about. That was the war. They didn't even know they were fighting. They thought they were just fighting the Nazis. They thought they were fighting an invading army. It wasn't about an invading army. It was about the evil that they were doing to these poor people by keeping them in camps and trying to exterminate them because of how they were born. how they were seen by this invading army. That was what the war was about, that they didn't even know they were fighting. And this hero in Jack Montgomery coming forward and saying, I was doing what I was supposed to do. I'm supposed to keep my men alive. I'm supposed to go and take out these nests so my guys can move forward. Always forward. Always forward. You know, going through this book, and I didn't read the whole book. I picked out parts of it. If you want to go through it, you want to get some details, more details on this, obviously look up things on Jack Montgomery. But this book was written by Michael P. Spradlin, and it's a smaller book. And if I told you where I got it, you'd be absolutely surprised. However, seeing the way that these heroes did what they did, it's so it's so rare to see these people that do these things, that become people that serve and are willing to put everything out there for other people. And it's so difficult to find, but if you look, you will find it. You'll find it everywhere you go. But you have to be willing to look beyond the superficial. And that's what our world continues to push on us by, Instagram and everything else, of course. But that superficial thing, it's not about money. It's not about cars. It's not about, how good looking that person on your arm is. That's not what life's about. It's about the heart and the character that each of these people possess. The wherewithal, the virtues that each of these people possess, that when they go out there and do things for other people and serve other people. And then the struggles that they have after having to deal with these things. That is why that's important, because they didn't ask to do it. They were just doing what they were supposed to do. And whether major trauma comes along, injury comes along, they're the ones that are still willing, because of who they are, to go into the fray. We can never forget that. We can never forget that. So, if you are looking to, let's say, get into shape, I'm kind of switching gears here just a little bit, but if you're looking to get into shape and you want to go, you want to figure out, you're looking to get into shape to either go in the military or become a police officer or firefighter or anything like that, you can go to A Dose of Ethos. Check those guys out. They have workout programs. They have workout gear. You can get Dose of Ethos. Get on there. See what program they have for you, what will work for you. They have programs for people getting ready to get in shape or people that are wanting to get back into shape. You can do it. A Dose of Ethos. When upon checkout, type in "what's a hero," you get 10% off whatever program or whatever stuff you're going to buy from them, and it will help you. Like I said, it gets you 10% off. Just put that in there and help those guys out, but you're going to help yourself out in the process, which is super cool. So if you want to learn more about the What's a Hero podcast, you can go to our website, the What's a Hero podcast.buzzsprout.com. Type that in, take a look at it. You can also find us on the interwebs. We're on Instagram, and we're on Twitter, and we're on the Bookface, and I'm on LinkedIn. You can find us on all those platforms. And you can find, like I said, on the website, it has all of our previous episodes plus links to whatever podcast platform you like to listen to podcasts on. If you've never listened to podcasts and just somehow you got a hold of this one, awesome. You can go back and hear all of ours. But you can subscribe on Apple, and you can subscribe on Spotify and everywhere else. Get on there, and you can download each of these episodes. It'll let you know every time a new episode pops up. So with that, I do want to thank all of our heroes out there. All of you guys that are work in those front lines, our nurses, our teachers, those of you that every single day wake up, and our firefighters, our EMTs, that wake up every single day and go out into the fray and go through stress, go through trauma, go through problems, go through all the ups and downs that in order to serve other people, to help them be better, because that's who you are. You are appreciated. To our law enforcement officers who see day in and day out the worst of people and yet continue to wake up to want to serve them and help make their society, make their community better, we salute you. We thank you. And to our veterans out there on the front lines, taking it back to the enemy, taking it back and doing what you're supposed to, just doing a job. But in doing so, you are keeping us safe and providing us to be the best nation in the world. And you're doing with a heart of a servant. That makes the difference. We salute you as well. Thank you. And so to close this out, I'm going to read Jack C. Montgomery's Medal of Honor citation, which reads, "The United States of America, to all who shall see these presents greeting. This is to certify that the President of the United States of America, pursuant to the acts of Congress approved March 3rd, 1863, and July 9th, 1918, has awarded in the name of Congress the First Lieutenant Jack C. Montgomery, Infantry, United States Army, the Medal of Honor, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity involving risk of life above and beyond the call of duty in action with the enemy near Pataglione, Italy, 22 February 1944. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life and above and beyond the call of duty, 22 February 44. 2 hours before daybreak, a strong force of enemy infantry established themselves in 3 echelons at 50 yards, 100 yards, and 300 yards, respectively, in front of the rifle platoons commanded by Lieutenant Montgomery. The closest positions, consisting of 4 machine guns and 1 mortar, threatened the immediate security of the platoon position. Seizing an N1 rifle and several hand grenades, First Lieutenant Montgomery crawled up a ditch to within hand grenade range of the enemy. Then, climbing boldly onto the little mound, he fired his rifle and threw his grenade so accurately that he killed 8 of the enemy and captured the remaining 4. Returning to his platoon, he called for artillery fire on a house in and around which he suspected that the majority of the enemy had entrenched themselves. Arming himself with a carbine, he proceeded along the shallow ditch, as withering fire from the riflemen and the machine gunners in the second position was concentrated on him. He attacked the position with such fury that 7 of the enemy surrendered to him, and both machine guns were silenced. 3 German dead were found in the vicinity later that morning. As First Lieutenant Montgomery continued boldly toward the house 300 yards from his position, it was now daylight, and the enemy observation was excellent across the flat open terrain which led to First Lieutenant Montgomery's objective. When the artillery barrage had lifted, Lieutenant Montgomery ran fearlessly toward the strongly defended position as the enemy started streaming out of the house. First Lieutenant Montgomery, unafraid of treacherous snipers, exposed himself daringly to assemble the surrendering enemy and send them to the rear. His fearless, aggressive, and intrepid actions that morning accounted for a total of 11 enemy dead, 32 prisoners, and an unknown number of wounded. That night, while aiding an adjacent unit to repulse a counterattack, he was struck by mortar fragments and seriously wounded. The selflessness and courage exhibited by First Lieutenant Montgomery in alone attacking 3 strong enemy positions inspired his men to a degree beyond estimation. Lieutenant Montgomery, we thank you for your service. We thank you for everything you did at Anzio and during the war. I am Ken Frownfelter, and this has been the What's a Hero podcast. We are clear.